Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today to the fifth in a series of public scholarship presentations sponsored by the Public Humanities Hub at UBC Vancouver, a presentation on marketing your monograph. I'm Mary Chapman, the inaugural director of the Hub, which is a 3-year pilot to foster collaboration among humanities scholars at UBC, with academic and community partners, and to help humanities scholars in arts, law, and education faculties at UBC share their research beyond the traditional scholarly publication genres. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that today's event, even as most of us are coming together from all parts of the world virtually, has been organized and developed on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, where UBC's Vancouver campus is located. In the Hub's programming, we hope to always foreground the situatedness in this space, where Indigenous communities and settlers from the Pacific Rim, Europe, and around the world can come together to exchange knowledge. We're grateful, as always, for the hospitality of the Musqueam, and we ask you to acknowledge silently today the hospitality of the Indigenous communities whose territories you are on. The Hub's public scholarship media training events have been developed to increase faculty and student comfort in the more public-facing genres of scholarship. In the coming year, we'll be hosting presentations about doing interviews, working with community partners, using social media, etc. We're also in the process of developing toolkits about how to do each of these genres at UBC. So you can see the first of these toolkits on academic podcasting on our website, publichumanities.ubc.ca. We will be building a toolkit about this presentation afterwards, but we invite you to check out some resources that we've already built on the event page of our website. For example, a list of awards that scholarly monographs in the humanities are eligible for, images of our 2 presenters' books, and a survey inviting you to tell us about your forthcoming book so that we can help promote it. Our long-range plan is to turn this public scholarship series into a credentialized free course offered to UBC scholars via Canvas. In addition to this series, our current plans for the coming year include a free online conference about the digital humanities on October 28th through 31st. Our keynotes are Tara McPherson, author of Feminist in the Software Lab, and Deanna Reeder, principal investigator of The People and the Text, Indigenous Writing. Please stay tuned about these upcoming events by joining our mailing list, liking our Facebook page, Twitter, and Instagram accounts. Today's event about marketing your monograph is moderated by Dr. Letitia Henville, pronouns she/her, who currently runs the Arts Co-op programs for PhD students in English and history. In September, she'll also be running the PhD co-op programs in philosophy, Germanic studies, and potentially one additional program. When she isn't wearing her UBC hat, Letitia writes a column on effective and stylish academic writing for university affairs. That column is called Ask Dr. Editor. Letitia is also an active member of the Hub Steering Committee. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you now, Letitia.
Thank you, Mary, for that introduction, and hello, everybody. I'd like to start our conversation today with a few questions that I've written for our panelists, but after about 15 minutes or so, we can open up the floor. Please feel free to contribute your questions using Zoom's chat feature, or you can use the raise your hand feature to signal to me that you would like to ask something with your own voice rather than having your questions voiced for somebody else. So I'd like to have us all practice raising our hands using Zoom. To raise your hand, please click on the button that says Participants. It's down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So it says mute, start or stop video, and then it says Participants. Please click on that button. And at the bottom of the right-hand side, you should see a gray circle with 3 dots that says More. And in that circle, oh my gosh, so many people are raising their hands. You're already one step ahead of me. So you figured out how to raise and lower your hands. So just like in the classroom, you got to keep your hand raised until your issue has been addressed. If you raise and then lower your hand, I'm going to think that your question has been answered and I'm not going to call on you. Thank you so much for all practicing raising your hands. So let me now introduce our 2 panelists for today. Dr. Renisa Mawani is Professor of Sociology and Chair of the Law and Society program. She's the author of Colonial Proximities from UBC Press 2009 and Across Oceans of Law from Duke University Press 2018, which was a finalist for the UK Socio-Legal Studies Association Theory and History Book Prize in 2020, and which won the Association of Asian American Studies Book Prize for Outstanding Contribution to History in 2020. In 2015 to 16, she received the Killam Prize for Graduate Teaching and a Dean of Arts Faculty Research Award, and she was named a Wall Scholar at the UBC Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Our second panelist is Dr. Heidi Tworek, who from 2 weeks from today will become Associate Professor, congratulations Heidi, in International History at UBC. Her book, News from Germany, The Competition to Control World Communications, 1900 to 1945, was published as an academic trade book by Harvard University Press in 2019. It has won 2 prizes, the Weiner Holocaust Library Frankel Prize and the Ralph Gomery Prize from the Business History Conference. The book has also received an honorable mention for the Council of European Studies Book Award and is currently a finalist for many more prizes. So welcome to you both, Renisa and Heidi. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Please feel free to unmute yourselves. The first question that I have for you has to do with the first word of today's webinar, which is the word marketing. What's your perception of marketing and promotion when it comes to scholarly research?
Heidi?
Sure. I mean, I think for most scholars, the word marketing makes us feel a bit like we want to break out in hives. So I think it's a complicated relationship that all of us have with this kind of idea of promoting our work. On the one hand, it feels essential. And there have been various studies done, for example, about how promoting articles on Twitter actually does lead to higher citation levels. So it's clear that there are some relationships, but on the other hand, it's really uncomfortable. And it also, I think, is something that we need to recognize embedded as sort of structural problems of who has access to networks of promotion and who doesn't. So I see it as sort of, it's an uncomfortable word, but it also describes an uncomfortable process. And so what I hope we can do today as well is talk about what makes sense for each person. There is no one ideal way of how you promote a book, how you deal with it. It depends on how you feel about it at that moment and sort of confronting this weird, uncomfortable feeling of promoting one's work. At the same time realizing that it's a way of getting the work out there and getting people to read it.
So when Letitia, when you first told us that this was going to be one of the questions, my response was, oh, I never marketed my book. I didn't, I don't know how to do that. And then as I thought more about it, I thought about the fact that, a lot of what we call marketing to me is more about community building and building an intellectual or a community of interlocutors. And that happens long before the book comes out as an object, right? So I think one of the benefits of taking a very long time to get a book out, so my first book took 10 years and the second took 9, is that you are able to meet many people along the way who help with, various things from research to, reading your work and so on and so forth. And so in many ways, I feel like the work of marketing and promoting, even though I cringe to call it that, really happens during this whole process where you're thinking about who your audience is, you're getting feedback from more senior people in the field, you're presenting your work at various venues and so on and so forth. And so I prefer not to call it marketing and promotion, and prefer to call it something more along the lines of community building. Because by the time, I don't know, Heidi, what your experience is, but Duke sends this massive questionnaire, and by the time you get to that point, so while the book is still in production, I feel like a lot of the answers to those questions are things that are answers or are responses that one has built over many years of community and engagement with students and others.
So it's not just about selling copies of the book and getting that sweet, sweet dividends check. It's about something else.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, Heidi made the point about the sort of structural inequalities that exist within the academy, which manifest also within publishing, right? And so I think part of in this particular historical moment, many university presses have made statements about racial violence and about ensuring that they have, that they recruit and publish the work of Black, Indigenous, and scholars of color. And so we know that these are real systemic problems. And I think for many people, the idea around marketing a book is really about being part of a wider intellectual discussion, or creating a space that people can contribute to. So it's not just about you and your book, but it's about creating a wider community.
Yeah, I guess that I would add one way to sort of think about it. I love what Renisa is saying about building a community before you publish the book, because in a way I think of the book as kind of a hook to keep those conversations going, because of course hopefully you've already presented in some ways to many people. People know the book is coming, they're not quite sure what it will be, but I see it as it's a hook to start a whole host of new conversations, which can come in many different formats. So less about selling the book per se than hoping that the book is one thing that certain people will engage with deeply, but the book also contains many different ideas that you can potentially use the publication of your book as a jump off to then talk about the book in many, many different formats. So I try and have this, slightly pithy, silly phrase, book as hook, to think about how you keep sort of going with this in a way that works for you, right? Because I know some people who are frankly sick of their book by the time it comes out. I know I went through that phase at some point when you're doing the index and you think, I never want to think about this book again. But then I was re-energized when it appeared in my hand, right? So that you think about what's the thing that you personally are enthused about doing? Is it retrenching within the community you already have, or building a new one, reaching out to new people with the book as your hook?
So let's get into some specifics of some book as hook or marketing kinds of strategies or ideas. So I know, Heidi, you actually had a communications plan. Renisa, you didn't, but you had other ways of sharing your ideas and building your communities. Could you please tell us a little bit more about what marketing your monograph actually looked like?
Well, sorry.
Renisa, sorry.
So, I mean, I think in the years that I was working on this project, I was invited to give many lectures when the book was in production, same kind of thing. And I really used that as an opportunity to sort of to talk about the ideas in the book, to engage with and think with people in the audience, and also to sort of build beyond the book, as Heidi said earlier. And then, I think there's also, I did a interview with Hardeep Dillon, who's a PhD candidate at Harvard, for Borderlines, and then Black Agenda Report also featured my book on their website. So I think those sorts of things have been very helpful in terms of not just in terms of promoting your book, but also sort of distilling and translating your ideas to a wider audience, right? Or making connections to things that you might not have thought about in the context of the book itself. So the book is an object that comes out that's, it's 2 covers and many pages in between, but in many ways, I don't think it's actually an unfinished, I don't think it's a finished product. I actually think that we're always building on these ideas, whether we're sick of them or not. They really shape our intellectual trajectory. So those were just some of the things that I didn't actually really seek out. They just happened, and they were really wonderful opportunities.
So maybe because I'm a historian of media and communications, I decided to write a communications plan, and it ended up being 7 pages, so it was quite long. But it was also something for me to decide, what did I actually want to do, and who was I really trying to reach with this book? So I sort of tried to conceive of the different audiences that I was trying to reach and find different ways of engaging with them, and then figure out what would be enriching for me. So maybe I'll just talk briefly about sort of 3 different things. There's the sort of scholarly audience, the classics like, what journals do you want to review your book? That's something that usually your publisher, in sending you a questionnaire, will ask you, but there may be some negotiation depending on how many copies the publisher is willing to send out. There are also sort of scholarly venue podcasts like New Books Network. It may be that you want to reach out, figure out which one of the streams of New Books Network works for you. Then there's the presentation world, which obviously COVID has become somewhat different and maybe in some ways easier and more accessible than it was before. And at least my approach to the presentation question was to think about, what are the presentations where I can also learn something? So I tried to seek out ones that were very interdisciplinary. So for example, I did one where the comments on the book were by a historian and by someone who's actually a PhD student in internet law, who was then reflecting on how this history helped him understand the present. And I learned a great deal from that kind of dialogue. So it took the book into new venues for me, or with political scientists and others. So you can think about the sort of scholarly world. Another thing that I know some people do is they set aside some copies they send to particular people to try and encourage them to read it. You could theoretically use your research budget for that. Something that I didn't do as much, but I maybe wish I had, is just spend some time emailing people you have cited in the book or anything like that, just maybe to express your appreciation for how their work helped you, etc. So the sort of scholarly community building and thank yous. Then there was a sort of more outreach world, in part because my book was an academic trade book, but I think it's possible for anybody to do this. So there's the world of the conversation, for example, which is explicitly created to have partnerships between academics and journalists. And it often very much tries to feature work that wouldn't necessarily appear in the classic op-ed venues, tries to highlight questions of social justice, for example. So that can be a great place to go. And then I pitched a lot of op-eds, some of which got printed, but honestly, a lot of which didn't. So there's all sorts of barriers and reasons why that didn't happen. But if you're going to go down the sort of op-ed pitching route, know that almost anybody who got any of them printed, there's a lot of pitches and effort that goes into ones that don't get printed as well. And then finally, some things came to me at a certain point, as Renisa said, they weren't necessarily on my plan, but they happened anyway, that through some reviews somewhere, various YouTube channels or others picked up on the book and then invited me to participate in something. So there was the planned aspect, but then there was also the unplanned that just develops as your book goes out into the world and has a trajectory that you can't control. That's hopefully a very positive one.
I just want to add 2 things, and that is, first of all, thank you, Heidi. Now I feel more equipped for my next project. So I wanted to add 2 things. The first is that I did do a couple of a series of book panels, and some of those were, and book launches, and some of those were with other people, and some of them were on my own. And that was really wonderful. And part of it was to actually have commentators who were from different fields, as Heidi pointed out. And then the other thing is, people don't often think about the cover of their book. And I think it's really, really important, because at least one person has told me that they bought my book not because they knew anything about the topic or were interested in it, but because they loved the cover. So there you go.
I'm curious to know, Renisa, did you do any of the emailing people who were influential to your thinking or any of that kind of stuff?
So in the Duke questionnaire, they do actually ask you who you'd like to send your book to. And I think you can identify up to 10 people in addition to, I don't know if Duke asked about journals, but I think in the end they sent out a lot of books. But I did actually make a list of 10 people that I wanted the book to go to, and they sent it to others as well, because people came and, you know, thanked me for my book, for sending my book, and I was like, huh, Duke must have done that. But, you know, and part of that list of 10 people were people in the global south who I knew would have trouble accessing my book. And so I had them on my list so that they could at least have copies of it. And, you know, especially because I'm writing about South Asia, I wanted to have interlocutors that were in India who may not have access to the book through bookstores or libraries.
And that's that really intentional community building approach that you're talking about.
Yeah, and also many of these people are, you know, people whose work I read and, you know, was really, which was really instrumental to my own thinking. Some of them were people I knew, some of them were people I didn't, so.
So we've heard this big questionnaire mentioned a few times, so maybe let's talk about that in a bit more detail. I'm curious, when it comes to having your publisher help you to build new connections, to find an audience, what surprised you about what your publisher did or didn't do to help with marketing the book?
So I have to say Duke is incredible. I have edited collection coming out with them, which is co-edited with Antoinette Burton, and it's coming out in November of this year. And they've been really just incredible, both in terms of my monograph and also in terms of this edited volume. So, you know, part of it is they have this very comprehensive questionnaire, as I've now mentioned like 4 times, where they are asking about, you know, which prizes, for example, you think your book would be suitable for. I can't remember if they have places for like journal reviews, but they ask you to actually write several different descriptions of your book that they can use for marketing purposes. They ask for a list of people that you want to send your book to. And honestly, by the time I got to that point, I was just like, oh, I can't do this. You know, it was like the index had just been finished. And so I was thankful this time around to actually have Antoinette to work with and to look it over. But you know, Duke is very active on Twitter and on Facebook. And so they have been very actively promoting on my behalf. And they have a very sort of wide following of readers and of authors. And so it's been really nice to actually have it sort of circulate among those people.
Yeah, I'd actually almost forgotten about the questionnaire until you raised it again, because it's actually quite unclear to me, the relationship between the questionnaire that I submitted and what the press actually ended up doing. There's so many things about presses that are, I think, very hidden to us, the authors, as we go through the process, right? So I think it's really important to fill it out and spend the time. I remember now that I spent an entire day filling it out, and it was a really helpful step in developing my own communications plan. I'd say what the press did really well for me is they priced my book very well, and unfortunately, for better or worse, how many people buy your book and how many libraries even buy your book does depend to a certain extent on the price, I will say that I had no negotiating power on that as a first-time author. I would advise people to ask the question though, and see if you can get some confirmation on that, because this unfortunately is part of the sort of structural problems here, that publishers think X number of copies will sell, therefore they choose a price, but that price in turn determines how many copies will sell. So, I think there's certainly an attempt that should be made by authors to try and figure that out, because that's a big thing that the press does for you, right? And it often depends on what they think will happen to the book, but you may know there's a really great audience out there that they just haven't considered. So that is one sort of essential thing. The cover, as Renisa said, that's something the press can do really well for you. They did a great job with mine. I'm not a graphic designer. I don't know how to do these things. They came up with it, and it too is very striking. So they sent my book out for reviews because it was academic trade to a whole host of places, where it ended up getting reviews in the Washington Post or the Financial Times and so on and so forth. And that couldn't have happened without them sending it out in the first place. So those are lots of things the publisher can do, but I would say a lot of other things were absolutely up to me, and how much effort I wanted to put into it, how many op-eds I wanted to pitch, how many podcasts did I want to do. So I think you can ask the publisher, but it really is, it's complicated to know how much they're going to do, and it may be very worth asking other people, if you can, who are working with that press about their experiences. So knowing, okay, Duke is really great at doing these things, whereas another press might be good at doing something else. So I think they vary quite widely in how much effort they put into publicizing books.
Right, and so you might even have to follow up with certain presses on that questionnaire. Yeah, okay, yeah. So yeah, just to put a pin on that, like.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Is that, one of the things that Duke did that I didn't expect was that they put me in touch with a lot of people. And so my editor would go to conferences and talk about my book and what, and how that might connect to people's work that I don't know. So I actually met a lot of people through the sort of Duke network, which was really great.
So they're going to do some stuff and they're not going to do other things. And sometimes with some presses, you know what they're going to do, but other times if it's a new press to you and you haven't talked to people who've published with them, you may need to follow up and things. And so, yeah, it sounds like being careful to make sure that all of the connections are being made on your behalf. Sounds like something that you may need to advocate for with some presses. My last question before I open up the floor to the hands is I would love your one big thing kind of headline tip for clickbait in the internet. What's your biggest bang for buck, impact for effort, not too hard to do, but thing that had a really great impact in helping you find to a new audience? Favorite recommendation?
I'm going to defer to Heidi while I think about this a bit.
I'd probably say the New Books Network podcast. I mean, it turned out that the person who runs that stream, for my case, was someone who'd actually been an MA student at UBC. So it was a neat connection, but it was, I found the interview to be a really deep engagement with the book itself. I've always benefited from listening to those podcasts, and it's kind of extraordinary the range of people that they reach. So I found that to be rewarding for me, but also that it reached more people than I'd ever anticipated. So New Books Network, or sort of equivalent podcast, is a great thing to do.
Yeah, I did one podcast, which is yet to come out. But I think the interviews that I did were super, super helpful, and just really opportunities to think about how my work connects with other intellectual formations that I might not have anticipated or thought about.
So sorry, those were interviews with journalists or?
No, so I did an interview with for journals, so not journalists, but for journals, and so I think I did 3, and so they were all sort of different audiences: history, law, and then Black Agenda report reaches a wide range of communities. So yeah, they were really insightful and very helpful. And people seem to read them because they're short.
So I'd love to open up the floor for questions from our audience. Hannah, take it away. I don't know if you have the ability to unmute yourself, Hannah. There you are.
Hi, there's a really loud noise happening outside, so forgive me. I was just wondering, this might be really granular, but I have a book coming out. It's a hard copy first, right? A hardcover, library, $90 ridiculous thing. And I'm also not feeling eager to start promoting it right now during coronavirus and, you know, Black Lives Matter and all the other issues that are going on. So I'm just wondering, like, did you guys wait until you had a paperback that was viable by people before you started doing interviews? That was more easy to purchase, or did you start right away to get the library copies sold to libraries? What was the strategy there? I don't know how long to wait, basically.
So my first book, they only published in hardcover, and then the paperback came out a year later. And I was an assistant professor, and so I started sort of, I didn't really do very much around that book, but and then this one, Duke publishes in paperback, hardback, and ebook right away. So it was. So that was really helpful. And honestly, I had an opportunity to go with another press, which is also an amazing press, but I chose not to because I just was worried about the hardcover coming out first, and the paperback taking not a year, but maybe even longer, depending on how many books you sell. So.
Yeah, maybe I'd just say, like, it's always complicated when the book is quite highly priced. So I've done some edited volumes where that's also true. So I guess it depends on how much you want to get out the ideas in the book in different venues. So it might be one of these cases where, for example, individual emails to people who would then ask for it to be purchased in the library is actually pretty critical, because many libraries are cutting back on their book budget. So unfortunately, something that, say, 10, 15 years ago you could rely on, which is the book's definitely getting published and actually purchased by libraries, is no longer necessarily true. So I know in some countries, for example, it's the academics themselves who submit to the libraries that they want the book to be published. So I'd say that's a kind of baseline behind the scenes thing that you could consider, or maybe see what the press does on that. And then you figure out, okay, are there sort of distilled venues where I want to get some of this research out there in anticipation of a paperback, so sort of whet the appetite for people when the paperback comes out, because I don't think there has to be this sort of moment where the book drops and then you go and do a bunch of promotion. Renisa made a good point. This is something we're kind of doing anyway by presenting, building a community of interest in it. So it's more of a continuum maybe than like curtain drop and it's theatre night. And that might be a better way to think about it. It's just one point, and then a paperback coming out would be another point where you might then do more things to reach an audience who would have access to the paperback.
But Heidi, I know that you had more points than just the releases of the book. Could you tell us a little bit more about other times that were in your comms plan, in terms of when do you contact jurors for a book prize or send them your book, or when do you, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I really went on a deep dive about book prizes, in part because my book, just like Renisa, actually touches on many different disciplines and areas. So I spent several days going down many website rabbit holes to find a bunch of prizes, to do a massive Excel spreadsheet for the press. And actually some of the prizes that my book is now a finalist for were ones that I found, not the press. And in some cases, very, very rare though, the press said no to sending it out because there was a small fee associated with entering the book for that prize. So that's something I kind of do every month, actually, even now, because although the book was published in March 2019, there are still prize deadlines, right, that end in 2020. So you can end up actually doing this for quite some time afterwards. So you can also, there may be things related to anniversaries or other things like that. There might be other moments where you might want to write about the book. I mean, in my case, there were things like legislation in the US that was created in the 1930s, partly in response to Nazi spread of news, that then came up in the news again related to potential foreign interference in American news, right? So that was an opportunity to write for the Washington Post Made by History series to bring historical context to what was happening at this moment. So I think there are lots of ways in which, even when the book is published, there are these kind of opportunities where you might just want to know that you're doing that. And I'd say in a lot of these sort of more traditional venues, the book really is a hook, because they're just likelier to take your op-ed if you write them a pitch and say, I've written a book about this. So it's not that they've read the book, it's that you have standing as an expert because you've written the book.
Yeah, in my experience with media, when you can connect your expertise to ongoing conversations that are in public discourse, that's a great way to ensure that to increase the likelihood that your op-ed would be published, that you'd be invited onto the podcast, that you'd be invited onto YouTube. I'd like to throw to Sydney to voice any questions from the chat for us.
Yeah, so we've got two questions here. The first one, I think, is for both Heidi and Renisa. It's, can you talk about launches your book had? How were they organized?
So my first launch was at the Peter Wall Institute with Sebastian Prange, which was really, really wonderful. And it was actually really amazing just to have so many people who had been involved in the book in various ways together in one room. So a lot of UBC colleagues, my partner and my children were there. My children both spoke, and as did Denise Ferrer de Silva, who's a close friend. And so it was actually just really wonderful to have that as the sort of first event. And then I did a launch with New Books in South Asia, which was at the Law and Society Association meetings in DC and in 2019. And then I just recently did a book event with 5 panelists at Queen Mary Law School in London. So, and you know, most of these were just things that were, I mean, Sebastian and I organized the book launch at the Peter Wall, but and I agreed to do the New Books in South Asia, and then the panel at Queen Mary was organized by Max Delmar, who's a faculty member there, and because I was going to be there to give a lecture anyways. So I think it's a really important moment, and to have a book launch and to have it with people that you are, you know, that really means something to you.
Yeah, so it's actually a nice story, because I'm super happy to have Renisa on this panel with me, because it was her book launch that inspired how I did mine. So it just shows it's always a continuous chain of learning, because it was such a wonderful event that combined thinking about the academics with some sense of the sort of personal investment, not just by the person whose name is on the cover, but also the sort of broader family and otherwise friends and support network that go into creating what is, you know, otherwise seems like a single person, single author book. So I was very much inspired by that. So I ended up also having my launch at exactly the same venue, but I was actually helped by someone who's on the call, Anna, who helped to secure the space for me. And then I decided to invite someone from history and then someone from the journalism school, so Eagle Glassheim and then Mary Lynn Young, to both just speak very briefly about the book, because it was combining these different perspectives. So I would say it's a really great thing to do. There's a catharsis to it. It does give you a sense that the book is here, because it never really quite has a moment when it's exactly published, right? Like you get it in your office, but then it sort of comes out and there isn't really this one moment. And having a launch is kind of like a graduation from university. It gives you a sort of catharsis. So in whatever way that people feel comfortable, I think it's actually really nice to mark the moment in some way that's distinct from presentations about the book.
Okay, thank you for that. We've actually got a couple questions here in the chat. So the second one is, can you talk about your experience on sharing excerpts?
I can talk about that if you want. So I had, in one instance, an Austrian magazine actually reached out to me and asked if they could take an excerpt and then publish it in German in that magazine. So that ended up happening, but it is not common, would be my my sense. Like the press was, I think, a bit surprised that this ended up happening. I mean, more things that are likely are reviews or you writing in a sort of conversation. So I had something that happened where one journal contacted me and a couple of other people to write around questions around communications, privacy, doing research in this area. So it wasn't really an excerpt, but more me writing back. So the only case that I had was this Austrian magazine, but not anywhere else.
And Duke makes the introduction to all books available on their website. So they have that available for free, and it says, you know, it's part of their marketing strategy to get people to buy books. So, but nobody's contacted me for an excerpt of any kind.
Okay. And then our final question here in the chat is, could you say more about pitching op-eds?
Shall I take that one?
I'm just holding up a copy of Mira Sucharov's Public Influence, A Guide to Op-Ed Writing, Social Media Engagement from 2019 from U of T Press.
Ah, okay. I wrote an op-ed around, well, when Justin Trudeau apologized for the Komagata-Maru, and in 2016 I wrote this op-ed that was actually published in the Globe and Mail, and it was, of course, 2 years before the book came out, and so they did actually mention the book. But that's the only op-ed I've written, so Heidi probably has much more experience.
I would say that there's maybe a spectrum of categories here. So I had been writing a few op-eds before this, so in some cases these were places where I had written before, so I had a pre-established relationship. So that then makes the pitching a little bit easier, in the sense that the first part of it that's tricky is, who do you even write to pitch it? Because in many cases when you write to the sort of generic email address where there's like pitches at whatever it is, you may or may not get noticed for all of the sorts of structural and other reasons that we've discussed before. So in some cases when I pitched something, I was able to pitch it to someone where I had written something before, which in and of itself was a sort of long battle, right, to get things into various places. But I think it's also where asking others is so critical. So for anybody who's on this call who sees somewhere I've written for where they think that they have a piece that might fit, get in touch with me, because in many cases, places that I wrote for, the history of how I ended up being able to write for them was someone else used their power to open the door for me to write and put me in touch with whoever was the gatekeeper towards that op-ed, and then I was able to establish a relationship, because the truth is that this is still very much a sort of network-driven business in many ways. As you know, Marilyn Young and Candace Callison have written about this sort of systems journalism problem. But anyway, as I say, anybody on the call who's interested, I'm happy to discuss, and if there's appropriate contacts, to make them. But in some cases, I just tried cold pitching. So I would also look and see who is a publication or who's a person who's written about things that make sense. And then I would just cold email them. Sometimes I would see, okay, blah journalist has written on a topic where they've also mentioned the history of German media. I mean, this is obviously a common trope and has been for the last 4 or 5 years, to make sometimes very facile comparisons to the past and what has happened with media in the past. So I would just send the journalist an email and say, dear blah blah, so great that you were writing about this. You might be interested in this book that I've written, or I'd be really excited to write an op-ed for you, something like that. As I say, I'd say maybe 90% of those probably didn't work out, but there were maybe 10% where it's really established a connection with someone, and that in the end led to an op-ed. So maybe the final thing I'll just say is about the pitch. There's obviously many books you can read about this, but like, it's got to be short, because journalists get so many emails. Your pitch must be short, very to the point. You've got to have only one argument. These things are very short. And maybe actually, sorry, a final thing would be writing for the conversation really is a great place, because I actually learned a lot from writing for them and having journalists who were committed to editing academics and who know the sort of pitfalls that academics can fall into. And the conversation tries to make sure your language is accessible, but not that your ideas are dumbed down.
Yeah, so the conversation does a lot of hands-on work with the people who publish with them, and so they're an often recommended avenue. I'm wondering if I can ask how either of you tied this work that you did with marketing the book into your CV for tenure and promotion. For example, when you write about your book, when you do a podcast or an interview for a journal, like, can you put that interview for that journal somewhere in your CV? How do you make universities recognize this work as work, or metrics, or any advice for that section?
So absolutely. I mean, all the talks that I've been invited to give about my book as it was in progress, and then after it came out, I list in invited talks and lectures. I have a space on my CV where I put all the interviews, and so I think it's called Short Essays and Interviews. So even short things that I might write that build off of the book, that are not sort of peer reviewed, I put there. And then I usually, there's no spot for it on the UBC CV, but in my sort of non-UBC CV, I also have a list of all the places that the book has been reviewed. So that's not, which I think is also a really important part of the whole sort of talking about your book and building community, is to think about reviews and who will review it, and and if you're a senior person, you should be reviewing the books of junior scholars and helping them out and helping to promote their book, right? And so this is what I mean by part of building community, that it's not that there are also obligations on people who have books out in the world to do that labor for others.
Yeah, I think Renisa has given a good sense of how you can mold at least the non-UBC CV in the way that makes sense for you. So I think it depends on what people do, right? Like some people also do policy reports like I do. And so my categories have changed over time because it depends on how much of anything that you do. But actually based on advice that you gave me, Letitia, I would say if you are doing lots of media engagement, that can also include when journalists ring and speak to you and it ends up being a one-sentence quote, but you talk to the journalist for a certain amount of time. So for example, my book was about the history of news agencies, many of which still exist, like Reuters. So I spent a lot of time figuring out who are these news agencies who are journalists might want to write about this book. So in the case of one of these news agencies, the person said, I'm not going to write about your book, but I would like to talk to you about various issues raised within it. And this was an hour-long conversation that ended up as one quotation. So Letitia advised me, make a sort of Excel spreadsheet of media engagement where you note when you've done this and maybe you note time. So that it doesn't necessarily have to go in your public-facing CV, but maybe even your UBC CV or somewhere else, or in your tenure and promotion package. If you're doing something like that, you can give something time as a proxy for that engagement, because you might just say quoted in X number of newspapers, but much media involves so much labor that isn't actually reflected in the amount that you're being quoted. So I think if that's something that you end up doing, it's worth thinking about how to measure it in different kinds of ways that are visible to the metrics of the university as it currently exists.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that, I've done 47 hours and 13 minutes of interviews, just like they want numbers, give them those numbers, is kind of how I feel about this sort of thing. Sydney, can I throw it over to you for questions for the chat?
Sure, there's one more that just came in. This is also, I'm assuming this is also for Heidi and Renisa. How do you or can you account for the inclusion of your books on syllabi? Do you actively ask for folks to let you know when they're teaching your books? And does this help at all to include in a tenure promotion file?
That's a very good question. I didn't include any of that material for my tenure and promotion or for my promotion to, well, when I was promoted to full, my book was just in production. So it wasn't yet out in the world, but I think that I think this is incredibly important to have these sort of, the kinds of things that fall under the radar, that aren't sort of quantifiable as a way of sort of demonstrating your impact, right? So if you're a junior person, this is your first book, you're, coming up for promotion, then you should be able to talk about, and you should talk about, who's teaching your book, instead of just sort of focusing on the metrics of citation counts, right? So I think that these are important things to actually flag and identify.
Yeah, I've heard anecdotally from people who've taught my book, which is a sort of amazing and weird thing that reminds you that the book now has its own life that is beyond you and beyond your control. It's been anecdotal, so I think it would be great for people if they can include that in some way. I mean, particularly having just been promoted to associate, I spent a lot of time reading, what does the tenure and promotion guidelines of UBC say? And at least, to associate, it says national recognition, and to full, it says international recognition. Of course, what exactly that means is quite unspecified, but I would imagine that one way in which that could be incorporated is if your book is being taught in various different places. It's of course a very hard thing to collect, but it might be something that's worth certainly including, that there are at least these places where you have confirmation that the book is being taught.
In X institutions in the following countries, something like that. I have one last question just from myself, and that has to do with something we've touched on a little bit, which is social media. There are many reasons to dislike social media. Do you recommend that people get on Twitter? Do we have to be on Twitter? Do we have to make dancing videos on TikTok? Like, what do you do with social media, and would you recommend it?
Oh gosh, I just had this conversation with my son yesterday, who was encouraging me to do more on social media. I just joined Twitter. I'm like way behind. I don't think I've actually tweeted anything, to be honest. I used Facebook sort of along the way just to give people a sense of like talks that were coming up that they might be interested in. I have a web page outside of the university website. And that's about it. I know I could be doing much more, but I actually find it really, I find it very uncomfortable to be sort of self-promoting on these various social media platforms. I did actually say, so I will just say that as when the COVID lockdown first started, I did say that because I watched a TikTok video on Bhangra, I said that I was going to practice and I was going to become a Bhangra queen by the end of it. That has not happened yet.
So I am on Twitter, but I will say that a lot of it for me is also dependent on what you study, right? Like a lot of my motivation for getting on Twitter in the first place is as somebody who studies communication and media, and I've just found it an amazing place to connect with scholars I've never met in person, find scholarship. Those were my motivations, less the self-promotion aspect of it and more the discovery of new communities of people. And so I think it depends on what you want to use it for, but I would also acknowledge, as somebody who has spent a lot of time actually researching online harassment, that we should also be pretty clear that it can potentially come with some significant costs, right? And so it's just worth being cognizant of that, thinking about who you want to be online, what's appropriate for you, how you might deal with the sort of hostile stuff that unfortunately can happen, has happened to me on a very low level, but sometimes ends up happening to others in really egregious and unacceptable ways. So, you know, to figure out beforehand, what do you want to do with it? Who do you want to be? I don't really have the sort of self-promoter persona, because I see it more as a space where I can find others' work. I can lift up work that I think is really amazing and deserves a wider audience. So maybe there's just different mindsets that you can bring to it. And the good thing is also that the Twitter, despite its many flaws, does bring a bunch of tools where you can mute, block, etc. You can curate in lots of different ways. So you might just want to think about what your strategies would be if you want to start really heavily engaging. Also because it depends on what your topic is as to how far the potential, you know, the real existing potential negative sides can come out as well. So I don't want to be a downer about it, but I think we have to be very aware of the potential negative sides of this, which fall disproportionately on women and racialized peoples.
I have seen some evidence that when there's initial positive response to a tweet, an op-ed, or whatever it is, it then becomes much harder for people to pile on negatively. So by reinforcing other underrepresented minorities, other Black and Indigenous and scholars of color, other women, other non-binary people, by amplifying and responding positively to them, there is some evidence that has the potential to maybe, hopefully, cut down on some of the evil harassment. But having said that, Twitter is still, and many of these other social media platforms are still not only ugly places, but just evil in their algorithms and all that kind of fun stuff. So ending on that note, I'm wondering, is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to mention as a last point?
You know, I want to sort of just make a pitch that for, you know, anyone who's sort of more senior, and that, you know, if you have written a book, you should be helping others, especially Indigenous, Black, and scholars of color who don't necessarily have the same kinds of networks that other scholars have. You know, introduce them to your editor and offer to read things, all those kinds of things. Write a review. I mean, if you're able to actually write a review for, you know, a recent author, that's an amazing gesture of both solidarity, but also really reaffirming the work of this particular person. So, so that's my sort of last pitch. And also, if anybody who's you know, listening would like to get in touch with me, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, that'll be you in 2 weeks when you get that associate professor status confirmed. Then you'll be that senior scholar.
Oh, that feels very weird. Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. You know, I too have benefited from people who have introduced me, as I said, to editors and others, and I'm more than happy to offer to help people to think about what works for them. But I guess I would end by saying it really is up to you what you want to do, and there isn't one right way. If you don't want to write op-eds, you don't have to do it. You figure out what makes sense for you, what would you feel comfortable with, what would you enjoy doing, what would be academically and personally and emotionally fulfilling, and there just isn't a one size fits all here. There's what makes most sense for you and your book, and then there's sort of an appropriate plan, even if that's not having a plan and just seeing where it takes you. So just because I had a 7-page plan, it does not mean everybody has to have one. I think it's just maybe having that, spending half an hour to an hour or however long it is, just thinking about what would be fulfilling for you when your book comes out, and then acting on that, and maybe just brainstorming with some senior scholars and others about what that plan looks like that makes most sense for you.
Heidi and Renisa, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us this afternoon. Thank you to our participants for attending, and to Mayor Chapman and the rest of the Public Humanities Hub for pulling this event together. If you're a participant in this event, I want to remind you that you can check out the events page at the publichumanities.ubc.ca. So you can access resources, and that's where you'll get to share any information that you'd like to share about your own forthcoming book. So publichumanities.ubc.ca, and check out the events page. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much. And thanks, Heidi.
Yeah, thanks, Renisa. Thank you, Letitia.